Hail and well met. My name is Reverend Adam Hayden. I am a witch, priest. I'm currently a third year student of the Temple of Witchcraft Mystery School. I am a graduate of the International Metaphysical Ministry. I hold a bachelor's in metaphysics. I'm a metaphysical practitioner and an ordained minister. Now, I used to have a lot of videos here on YouTube. And due to a lot of things and a need to reboot my life, I deleted most of them. The reason for that is a redevelopment of who I am. So for the last 3 years, I've been dealing with a lot of shadow work, a lot of building boundaries, about working with specific entities conducive to my pathway. And so I've stepped back from doing videos. I've stepped back from a lot of other things. So as I mentioned, I'm a third year student of the mystery school for the Temple of Witchcraft, and that is the Temple of Shamanic Witchcraft. And now a lot of people will go ahead and have these preconceived notions of shamanism, what it represents, what it teaches. And the fact that since a person does not come from like Siberia, they're not indigenous, many people believe that practicing certain techniques that might seem to some degree to be connected to indigenous practices, it's usually looked down upon. And so I am in the last month of this course. And in this last month, I've dealt with a lot of what's calling distilling the shadow. Now, the exercise used for distilling the shadow in this particular tradition is about making a list of bullet points. Bullet points for 4 different categories: fear, anger, resentment or jealousy, and guilt and shame. And so I've been heavily concentrated on that, dealing with past traumas related to my childhood, dealing with and changing those things about me that I internalized due to my upbringing, into those things that were not conducive to me as a person. You see, I was raised in a Christian fundamentalist household. I was literally beat because I was interested in just learning about Wicca, the occult, ceremonial magic. I had to leave when I was 18 because I was now free to be booted out of the house because I did not follow their God. I would not suffer the injustices raised upon me. So for me, wishing to be an adult had nothing to do with frickin' being able to buy cigarettes or vote or any of that thing. For me, it was to be able to be free of such things, only to find it follow me and now be visited upon the whole nation here in the US. Now, I knew it was going to happen. You know, I don't try to tout my horn as a prophet or a seer or someone who has seen certain events that have come to pass. I've never been one to tout myself as anyone important. I don't need to try to be humble because that's just in my nature. I believe that we are all psychic, that we all have the potential to do great things beyond what we've been told we can do. And so, as an early child, I had foreseen not necessarily the specific events that has occurred in the last 30 plus years, but because I lived within it, because I was persecuted by it, I could easily see how it could filter into society. I was told about the Seven Mountains Mandate. I knew because I had experienced the abuse of the loving God that is Christ. I have every right to be angry and furious by that faith. I am not one of those people that think that, oh, it's a loving religion, so I should forget. I am not bound by those rules. I believe in accountability. Your idea of sins does not bear upon my life whatsoever. So, during the pandemic, I did what I called Tarot Tuesdays. I use tarot as my connection as an oracle to channel information between realms, between that which we could call the unseen and that which we see every day. The tarot is my usual means of conveying that information. Sometimes, not often, I use the runes. I do pendulum work. I use biofeedback. And sometimes I use invocation, evocation, or even a slight possession. And it's not necessarily that's like those last few, isn't necessarily because I planned it. Specifically, the slight possession. Sometimes my higher self and the entity in question will go into cahoots. And yet, when I do those trance works, I leave myself open purposely for such ability to convey information. And so, during a pandemic, I'd sit for roughly an hour. I'd kind of divulge a little bit of my ideas about current events. And then I would pull cards. I would go into a slight trance and I would pull cards. I would use my tools that I'm pretty good at to convey what spirit is telling me. And during that time, those actual visions, those actual card interpretations would come to pass. Not necessarily as direct events, like while I may have seen 9/11, while I had seen the wars in Yugoslavia during the time of frickin' Clinton, there were other things I had seen. I have seen parts of the insurrection. I have seen parts of what has been happening in Florida. I have seen the rise and the use by Christians to persecute others just because we do not hold the same ideas. How much of that has been colored by my study of Revelations, my indoctrination as a child, with like the Seven Mountains Mandate, the rise of Christian fundamentalism within politics. I may have not necessarily seen or knew when exactly these things would happen, but I knew it was coming. And growing up, most people thought I was crazy, or I'm so torn and traumatized that I'm seeking validation. I am seeking some sort of recognition, fame, applause, or any of that stuff. No, I'd rather be ignored for the most part because I'm very much of an introvert. I do not try to get myself out there, and even do videos like this is really hard for me because growing up, I was not seen. I was not heard. I was locked in my room like a slave, like a prisoner, because I would not bow to their God. I had an open mind. I was curious about the world. I was learning how to control my gifts because it was literally causing me not to sleep at night, fall asleep in school, to lash out. So through many years, I told those closest to me that these things would happen. And I don't know whether they believe me. That's fine. But I knew it was coming. And so the last couple years, I had been starting to notice a certain entity which I don't necessarily vibe with, in the sense of I did not seek it out. I feel very little connection to this entity, but I've begun to see how this entity has been reaching out to me for so long, and that was always on like the periphery of my life. Like most of my exes who were interested in the craft had always felt drawn to the Morrigan. And I personally know very little, or remember and recall very little. I know none of the language about the Irish mythology and about her personage. It is only very recently, after a certain few experiences within my classwork in the Temple of Witchcraft, that I had been to the point where I couldn't ignore it. I could no longer ignore it. When I discovered that one of the portfolios or characteristics of An Morgan was connected to prophecy, to battle, to the seeking of peace, to sovereignty, that I begun to realize that within certain dreams and visions as a child, that she herself, their selves, had come to me to show me things. And in one of my exercises, in my communication with herself, she explained to me a concept that only recently other people, specifically after I did a certain TikTok on it and a certain small little clip that I posted on Facebook a while ago, that many of those who have been called to the craft due to certain psychic experiences, such as prophetic dreams or precognitive things, had experienced to some way, shape, or form, because everyone's idea of this concept is very different. How it expresses is very different for each individual. But they've received a bit of trauma that caused a form of soul loss. There was an emptiness of a portion of self that ran away, that left, was siphoned away. And so something, like in anything else, with a vacuum, something has to come in to fill it. Sometimes that is addiction. That's much a seen world aspect of how one deals with such trauma. Addiction, massive spending, ruthlessness, cruelty, but other things can happen, such as the interest of certain spirits. Some benign, some malignant. And for me, as an early experience in the craft and trying to understand my visions, she herself, in an aspect, came to me. And I did not know her. I did not recognize her at that time. But that in payment for the trauma I was receiving and would receive, that I would be able to be prepared for things that would happen in the future. Certain of, not necessarily events, but certain ideas and concepts that would be presented on the world stage. While I had wished and hoped and even prayed that those things wouldn't come to pass, and it was just a fitful imagination of a traumatized child. Unfortunately, it had begun to come to pass. And this was before Trump. This was even before frickin' George Bush Jr. became president of the US, even though Gore should have won. Popular vote. If Gore would have been put in, much of what I had saw would have been pushed back. We would have been more prepared. But you see, the Morrigan had prepared me. Though I didn't recognize her, as I mentioned. Time went on. My own trauma had created within me a darkness that I did not know. A ruthlessness. Now, I'm a Scorpio sun. So naturally, when everyone thinks of a Scorpio, they exude sexuality of lust and control and jealousy. Yeah, for many things, I had those things. I believe more of that was trauma based because my moon is Cancer. I am very much family oriented. Most of those close to me, I consider family in some way, shape, or form. My ascendant is Aquarius, and so I have lofty ideas. I see futures of joy and happiness for not just myself, not just those closest to me, but for the wider world. And while I know this transfer from the age of Aquarius, from the age of Pisces, is going to be dark, dangerous, bloody, and violent, I know in the Golden Path, as I call it, I got that from Frank Herbert's Dune series. And I agree with a lot of it, which is funny because it is science fiction. But within this golden path, there is a brighter future waiting before us. Whether it's going to take a short time, or whether it's going to take a nuclear holocaust and death and destruction of a wider scale, because I had foreseen that as a possibility. fate and prophecy is not dead set in stone. It can always be shaped and manipulated, pushed in time, you know, not fixed events. Death tends to be fixed events, but certain of those types of events and stuff can change according to choices. But the Morgan has showed up as I changed and adapted and grew up and unlearned things that didn't suit me, embraced things that were more in alignment with myself. That the Morgan had always kind of traveled around me, like within my circle of influence, but not enough to sit there and say, hey, listen up. I'm here and I've got something to tell you. My ex-wife, my first ex-wife, the mother of my boys, she was very interested in the Morgan. I don't know how interested, because at that time I was dealing with a lot of my own shit. The movement from childhood to adulthood to being a husband, long-term relationship, first long-term relationship, a father, trauma, which led to addiction, a manic episode from bipolar disorder that I did not know I had. But she was there on the periphery. And then there was a lot of succeeding relationships where the Morgan played a very powerful part in our lives, but more on my partner's end. Including my current nesting partner. She is very much, if she had a patroness or a matron, it would be the Morgan. And because I believe, because I believe in matriarchy, especially since I live in the land and property that will be passed to her from her father. She, to me, is very much Lady Sovereignty. And as a priestess of An Morgan, it is only right and fitting that I should get to know the matroness of this land, of my partner. And so I began to do research. And while I've built a relationship, and she's still very distant, she interacts with me every once in a while. I interact with her on my end daily, because consistency and commitment goes a long way. It's like any other relationship. And so I try to treat it as such. She's my queen. In some aspects, sometimes I call her my mother, because I've always been drawn to the mothering influence of a strong woman, something I didn't have growing up. And so lately, she's made herself very present, especially as I'm doing this distilling the shadow exercise. And I've had to face some very hard truths. And today was definitely one of them. The dystopia I had foreseen for so many decades has finally touched someone I consider family. And while my circle of influence does spread wide because of Facebook, this is the closest one to me. And this person is going to end up homeless because she's on disability and her nesting partner is basically being, well, you know how corporations and people are when it comes to paying a living wage. So I lost it. I had finally had that last bit of a feather on my back that I lost it. I am so furious that the things I foresaw has come to pass. That, Dean in Supernatural, in that episode where he just frickin' loses it in the hotel room. I'm there and I am not a violent person. And so I've been reading a book about On Morgan by Stephanie Woodfield. And one of the chapters in this book talked about On Morgan and some of her attributes and characteristics and the experiences that Stephanie went through. And one of the chapters was based on what a lot of people would say is the opposite of the Morgan. And that is that she doesn't have you fight because she's necessarily a war goddess. She's not like Mars or Ares, who fight for fighting's sake, for conquering and controlling, but to set us up for peace. Can we learn to put down the sword when the battle is done? Can we find that peace after facing our traumas? Standing up and creating those boundaries that makes us feel safe, secure, and those around of us safe and secure. I thought I was ready for peace. I thought I was done in speaking what I had seen growing up, the various prophecies, or whatever you want to call it. But as I watch the news, as I watch TikToks about those things around the world, it just gets me even more upset, more of a righteous anger to see the ending of this violence and destruction. And for any Christians to come on this page, if the shoe fits, because me, as a witch and a pagan, our existence is very political. Always has been. I mean, Salem witchcraft trials for damn sake. The Inquisition for damn sake. You've never not played the victim. Well, we, once again, have had enough. We have had enough. And now, people sit there and say, oh, Adam, you're a reverend. You shouldn't be preaching such hate and violence. And, oh, remember, threefold law on the Wiccan Read. Yeah. You know that? Well, that was not necessarily created for the purpose of true paganism. That was created by a group of people who were just coming out of the shadows because of the end of the Fraudulent Mediums Act in Britain. We didn't want to be seen as violent because we were already being persecuted as soon as we came out. The Satanic Panic? Yeah. So, oh, you're being victimized by all the pagans and the alphabet mafia. Boo-hoo. Well, yes, I am a reverend. I am ordained. But my gods is not your gods. I do not have to turn the other cheek. And in fact, I'm sick and tired of it. And so many of us other witches were there too. Most of us have tossed off the Wiccan Read, and ye harm none. We also believe in protecting ourselves, the weak and misfortunate, the disabled, and those who are minorities. And so when I say we've had enough, we've honestly had enough. So I just decided I wanted to come on here, get some things off my chest, probably rile a few feathers, stir the cauldron, and make you really think, because we're not going away. In fact, we will fight harder. You know why? Because in the end, we will win. So remember that. We will win. It's our turn again, not yours.